Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's presentation on the CRA reporting obligations. Over the next 20 or so minutes, I'll try and give you an overview and an introduction to these reporting obligations and unpack what they're all about. So, we'll begin with an introduction to the CRA itself and quickly talk about what it is and set some context for these reporting obligations that I'll be talking about for the rest of this presentation. So the CRA is a piece of EU legislation which covers rules for the placing on the EU market for products with digital elements. Products with digital elements being products with software, they may be software themselves, and that they deal with digital data and communicate digital information. Now, this is a part of the CE marking regime in Europe, which affects many types of products and their legal placement on the EU market. The goal of the CRA really is to improve the level of product cybersecurity in the EU, and the requirements are all focused on cybersecurity. The CRA is different to other CE marking legislation in a couple of key respects. Firstly, it doesn't just apply to products at the point that they're placed on the market. The CRA imposes requirements that cover the entire product lifecycle, including the development process and ongoing support such as security updates throughout its lifecycle. Secondly, the CRA introduces reporting obligations, which we're talking about today, and these are where manufacturers have to report certain cybersecurity incidents to authorities, and these obligations even affect products which are on the market before the CRA comes into effect and beyond their maybe designated support periods. It's important to note two key deadlines here. Many of us are focusing on the 11 December 2027 deadline, which is when the full requirements of the CRA come into effect. But actually, these reporting obligations come into effect much earlier, on the 11th of September 2026. So the CRA could actually be arriving much sooner than you think. Now, I quite like this slide, which sets out the general obligations of manufacturers with respect to a particular product with digital elements, and places where these obligations around reporting fit into that. So along the top of the image, we can see a classical layout where we have the design and development of a product. There are certain pre-market activities that are carried out, such as conformity assessment and demonstrating compliance with the requirements of the regulation. And then the product is launched and it goes through this so-called maintenance or support period, whereby vulnerabilities that are discovered in the product with digital elements are dealt with, maybe supported through the issue of patches and other maintenance activities until the end of its support period, where the product effectively reaches end of life. Along the bottom, we can see where this obligation to report vulnerabilities and incidents then aligns with the life cycle of the product when it is out in the field during its support period. But note that at the end of the support period and beyond, while products are still potentially floating around in the market well after the official support for that product has ended, the reporting obligations continue. So now let's talk about the reporting obligations themselves and the timelines for them, which are quite strict. So these obligations, which begin from 11th of September 2026, require that when a manufacturer becomes aware of an actively exploited vulnerability, they have up to 24 hours to submit an early warning notification, and they submit that to ENISA, which is the European Cybersecurity Organization, and or their local CSIRT, or Computer Security Incident Response Team. Now, the CSIRTs are a network of organizations with responsibilities for cybersecurity in EU member states. Each EU member state has at least one, and generally speaking, it is to the CSIRT in the relevant member state to which a manufacturer will submit this warning and the rest of the reports under these obligations. 72 hours after having become aware of this actively exploited vulnerability, the manufacturer should submit a more detailed vulnerability incident notification, including descriptions of the corrective and mitigating measures and other such details of the nature of this actively exploited vulnerability. And then 14 days after submitting that vulnerability incident notification, the manufacturer should submit a final report, which includes a detailed description on the nature of the actively exploited vulnerability, maybe who has exploited it, information about how the exploit can be corrected and what measures have been put in place to mitigate the effects of it. The other thing that has to be reported, aside from an actively exploited vulnerability, is a severe incident. And this follows a very similar timescale. So when a manufacturer becomes aware of a severe incident, then again they have 24 hours to submit their early warning notification. After 72 hours, they then submit their notification, which includes more details about the specific incident and what corrective and mitigating measures can be taken. And then they have 1 month from then to submit the final report, which includes a description of the incident, the root cause, and again, details of mitigating measures. As you can see, these are quite tough timelines actually for manufacturers to meet. So it's important that there is some preparation done to be ready to be able to do this. The first thing we want to do is understand what do we mean by an incident. And for this, the CRA uses a definition from another piece of legislation called NIS2. And effectively, an incident is an event which can compromise the security of data or information or the accessibility of a service itself or of a network and information systems. Then we have to understand what makes an incident severe. And effectively, an incident is severe if it negatively affects or is capable of negatively affecting sensitive or important data or functions. Now, I think it's important to focus on this word capable of negatively affecting, and I would generally read in this context that capable could be interpreted to mean exploitable, as many potential vulnerabilities or issues that could be identified in a product with digital elements may not actually be exploitable in the particular context or implementation that is in that product with digital elements. But once it becomes exploitable, then it is capable of negatively affecting sensitive or important data or functions. Similarly, an incident is also considered severe if it has led or is capable of leading to the introduction or execution of malicious code. So again, it's all about the capability of the incident, the vulnerability, whatever it is that we're looking at, the exploitability of this thing to affect the product itself or the data or the network and information systems to which it communicates. So let's illustrate this with an example. And what I have here is a product with digital elements, a hypothetical device and or piece of software, and lurking within it somewhere is a potential vulnerability. Most products have at least some vulnerabilities in them waiting to be discovered. Along comes a malicious actor. They have uncovered this vulnerability. They find it and they exploit it, and they do whatever it is that they do. Once the manufacturer becomes aware of this, then within 24 hours, they make their initial report to ANISA and the CSIRT, and so follows the chain or the timeline of reporting obligations. Another possibility is that this vulnerability is discovered, it's an incident, and it is discovered by some other means, such as maybe there is a third-party vulnerability report. Someone outside of the manufacturing organization reports to the manufacturer, hey, I found this problem in your or potential problem in your product. It could be through internal analysis or routine pen testing or security testing. It could be through the detection of attempted attacks, or maybe some other security related event, such as, I don't know, a misconfiguration event has taken place that, upon investigation, reveals that it had security implications. In any case, whatever the nature, an incident has occurred related to this vulnerability, becoming known to the manufacturer. At this point, the manufacturer has to make a decision. Is this severe or not? And again, I like to think that an easy test of severity is it exploitable? If it is exploitable in the particular context and the implementation in this product with digital elements, then it is severe. And if it's severe, it needs to be reported to ENISA and the CSIRT following the timelines outlined in Article 14 of the CRA. If it's not severe, then there is no obligation to report this, and the normal internal vulnerability handling processes can be followed to mitigate this incident should it be required. So let's say we have a exploited vulnerability or an incident to report. The next question then is, how do we report these? So Article 16 of the CRA actually spells out a requirement for ENISA to establish a single reporting platform for the purpose of this reporting. And the reporting platform shall provide each member state or CSIRT with their own electronic notification endpoint. So effectively, there'll be a website or something for each CSIRT that manufacturers can use to make their reports of exploited vulnerabilities or incidents. And the CSIRTs will use this same platform to circulate information with ENISA and the other CSIRTs to other member states, maybe, where that product with digital elements is available. So as a manufacturer, you report to one CSIRT, and then that CSIRT then informs the other CSIRTs so that each member state where the affected product is available on the market, the CSIRTs can be aware of the incident or exploited vulnerability. And right now, this reporting platform is actually not online. It's not available yet. And the message from ENISA is that it is expected to be online by 11th of September 2026, which, curiously enough, is the deadline when these obligations come into effect. So we're being promised that the reporting platform will be available on time, but as of now, it is not currently available. The latest news I have is that it has been developed and is undergoing a testing phase, so it is quite realistic to expect that we hope it will be available. In any case, I would advise anyone who is affected to be looking out for information on the single reporting platform whenever it becomes available. The other thing that's clear is that manufacturers will need to know or determine which CSIRT they're going to have to report these incidents and exploited vulnerabilities to. And as part of that reporting, they need to know the member states where their given products with digital elements that they're responsible for have been made available. So a useful resource is the CSIRT's network. This is a website that provides information on who are the CSIRTs in each member state. This is a good starting point just to identify what are the organizations we're talking about, and when eventually the single reporting platform is available, these are the potential organizations that you may need to reach out to make these reports of actively exploited vulnerabilities. That still leaves the question, which CSIRT do you report your incidents and exploited vulnerabilities to? Now, if the manufacturer is established in the EU, this is relatively straightforward, and the first choice or the first primary way of determining which member state is the member states of the CSIRT to which the report is made, it is the member state where the manufacturer has a presence, and that establishment is where the cybersecurity of its products or the decisions related to the cybersecurity of its products are predominantly taken. So it's not necessarily the largest site, the site with the most employees, or the site that produces the most products, but it is the site where effectively the decision making relating to cybersecurity takes place. If such a member state cannot be determined, then the main establishment shall be considered to be in the member state where the manufacturer concerned has the establishment with the highest number of employees in the union. So effectively, your biggest site. So whichever member state that is the CSIRT to which reports can be made. For manufacturers with no EU presence, this gets a little bit more complicated because these manufacturers are not in the EU, but they still do need to report actively exploited vulnerabilities and these incidents, severe incidents, because if you're placing products on the EU market, you are subject to the reporting obligations and the other manufacturer obligations for that matter. So, if you have an authorized representative, then it's quite straightforward. The member state of the authorized representative is the one whose CSIRT reports are made to. Of course, it is not mandatory to have an authorized representative under the CRA. So, if you don't have an authorized representative, then the first option is the member state where the importer doing the most placing on the market of products is based. Again, it's not necessarily the biggest importer in terms of the size of operational business, but it's the one that's placing the highest number of the product on the market. If that cannot be determined, then maybe the distributor that is doing the most placing number of products in the market is known and relevant, and whichever member state that distributor is in will be the member state whose CSIRT reports are made to. If that still isn't clear, then quite simply is the member state where the highest number of users of the concerned product with digital elements is. So especially for things like legacy products, for example, which are not currently being placed on the market, it will be important to understand where is the highest number of users so we can determine, for example, which CSIRT will be notified should there be an actively exploited vulnerability. Now, in conversations about these reporting obligations, which relate to exploited vulnerabilities and incidents, which are generally non-exploited but exploitable vulnerabilities, the question of the CRA's vulnerability handling requirements is also often raised. And I think at this point it's important to be clear that while the CRA does have requirements around the handling of vulnerabilities, these requirements are not legally required until the 11th of December 2027. So until the 11th of December 2027, the only requirement actually is to report on actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents, but not necessarily resolve them, at least according to a process that complies with the requirements for vulnerability handling in the CRA. That comes later. However, it does stand to good reason that if you do have an actively exploited vulnerability or a severe incident, then some process should be in place to actually mitigate these or deal with these, because as manufacturers, we probably don't want to be having insecure products floating around on the market. Similarly, some of these requirements around vulnerability handling will enable manufacturers to actually become aware of these actively exploited vulnerabilities and incidents, because if you're not able to be aware of these things, it's difficult to report them. A little bit about these obligations, vulnerability handling requirements when they come into effect. There is a draft standard currently in development that will hopefully be published by the end of the year and harmonized, and that will provide a framework to address these essential cybersecurity requirements for vulnerability handling and how to implement that in a way that is compliant with the CRA. Now, I tend to view the vulnerability handling process that's outlined in the standard and by these requirements kind of like a customer complaints procedure. So effectively, as an organization, you have a means of receiving information or discovering vulnerabilities. So in the context of these requirements, it's putting in place a policy, it's having your software bill of materials so you know what components are inside your product, so that if a vulnerability appears in one of those components, you know it potentially affects your product. And then you have activities such as conducting regular security tests on the product or periodically, or having a means for third parties and external bodies to actually provide information, much like you may have a customer feedback mechanism or means for people to provide feedback to your organization about your products. In any case, once vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities are identified or highlighted to your organization through whichever means, the CRA doesn't specifically require this, but the standard does mention it, and I think it's a good thing to do and a natural thing to do, which is to do a sort of triage or verification of these vulnerabilities. How important are they? How severe are they? Are they actually exploitable? That will then determine, for example, if it's exploitable or has been exploited, is it something that A, needs to be dealt with urgently, and B, is subject to the reporting obligations. Once that's known, also then the urgency of remediation is determined, and the actual process of fixing and then releasing the fixes or whatever mitigating measures can take place. So this is a good process that will certainly aid the reporting obligations and dealing with vulnerabilities and incidents as and when they arise. But just being clear and to summarize, from the 11th of September 2026, the reporting obligation will be in effect. And this requires manufacturers to report to ENISA and the applicable CSIRT or the relevant CSIRT when they become aware of actively exploited vulnerabilities or severe incidents. The rest of the obligations of the CRA don't come into effect until the 11th of December 2027, which includes those essential requirements on vulnerability handling. That said, it would be good and wise to implement those vulnerability handling processes earlier, especially once you are in a position to do so, because that will allow you to know and become aware of actively exploited vulnerabilities or severe incidents, and to be able to determine, for example, are they severe and do they need to be reported? So that concludes this brief introduction to the topic of reporting obligations under the CRA, and also a bit about the vulnerability handling requirements that will come into effect later. So thank you for listening to this presentation. And of course, if you have questions or require further information, you can reach out to me at my email address on the screen. Thank you very much.